Close your eyes for a moment. Picture your first car. Remember that thrill when you first got behind the wheel? The feel of the steering, the hum of the engine, that mix of freedom and possibility. No matter how many cars you've driven since, that first one stays with you. Some things linger with you, even when you've let them go. For me, it was a '64 Chevy Impala I named Thunder. She wasn't just a car. She was freedom on four wheels, my companion through some of the best years of my life. Sitting here now, I can almost hear her engine purr again, feel the steering wheel under my hands. I sat back in the old armchair by the window, rain tapping softly against the glass as the night settled in. My grandson, Tommy, was curled up in the chair across from me, his eyes full of that eager, patient curiosity that only a kid can manage. He'd asked me about the old photo he found of a beat-up Chevy Impala, worn and sun-bleached, with faded lightning bolts painted along the sides. I chuckled to myself before taking a slow breath, the memories settling in, vivid and heavy with time. You know, Tommy, I began, my voice soft. There was a time when that old hunk of metal was everything to me. I called it Thunder, thought it was the fastest thing on earth. I laughed, shaking my head. Truth was, it barely held together on the best of days. The story started in the summer of 1967. I was 17, working at an old diner in a town small enough that I knew every bump and crack in the road. Back then, owning a car wasn't just about getting from place to place. It was freedom pure and simple. It was a promise of places yet unseen and adventures waiting right around the corner. But for a kid like me with barely a dollar to his name, it was also just a dream. One day, while on a smoke break behind the diner, I saw her, a Chevy Impala with chipped blue paint and those half-faded lightning bolts, just sitting in a nearby mechanic's yard, looking a bit lost. I asked around, and old Gus, the mechanic, told me it had been sitting there for years. The owner had left town and never returned, leaving it behind to collect dust. It wasn't worth much to anyone, but to me it was priceless. I scraped every penny I had, borrowed some cash from friends, and managed to strike a deal with Gus. He let me have it for $300 and some extra hours helping him around the shop. My heart pounded the whole way home the first night I drove it. It sputtered, shook, and even stalled twice, but by some miracle we made it. Now, this car was no prize. The seats were torn, and the engine had a rough, wheezy sound every time I turned the key. I'd spend hours fixing it up after my shift at the diner, tinkering with the engine, patching up the seats, and even painting over the faded lightning bolts. I had no clue what I was doing most of the time, but I didn't care. It was mine, and every grease stain felt like a badge of honor. My friends called me crazy for putting so much effort into that car, especially since it was more of a rust bucket than a racer. But when I finally had it running decently, I took them all for a drive one by one. We'd speed down the main road, windows down, the wind whipping through our hair. In those moments, we weren't just kids in a small town. We were wild, untouchable, like we owned the world. But then came that stormy night, the one that gave Thunder her name for good. It was late October, and the sky was heavy with rain clouds. My friend Billy and I were sitting in the car, parked by the cliffs overlooking the river, just talking about everything and nothing at all. The rain had started as a drizzle, but it quickly grew into a full-blown downpour, pounding against the roof of the Impala. Suddenly, the air changed. There was a flash of light, followed by a crack that shook the ground. Lightning had struck a tree nearby, and the road back down the hill was quickly flooding. Billy and I looked at each other, eyes wide, our hands gripping the seat. We had to get back home before the storm trapped us up there. I turned the key, and the engine sputtered, refusing to start. My heart pounded. The wind whipped harder, and rain blurred the windshield as I tried again. Finally, the engine roared to life, and I hit the gas, guiding Thunder down the winding hill. Every inch felt like a fight. The rain came down in sheets, blinding us, and the road was slick as ice. But somehow, we made it back in one piece. By the time I pulled into my driveway, my hands were shaking and Billy and I just sat there, catching our breath. That night, Thunder had become more than just a car. She was my partner in adventure, my shield against fear, my own little bit of lightning. From then on, every time I turned that key, I felt a spark of pride and something like magic. After that night, Thunder and I were inseparable. I drove her everywhere, to school, to work, to the Friday night dances down at the VFW hall. My friends and I would pile in, squeezing 5 or 6 people into the seats, laughing as we cruised down Main Street. I'd feel the weight of those nights years later, when life had changed and everything felt distant. But back then, we were just kids chasing the thrill, never thinking it'd ever end. There was one night in particular, though, that always comes to mind. It was a clear summer evening, the kind that feels like it'll last forever. We'd all gone to the lake, just a handful of friends and me, bringing along some old records, food, and a thermos of terrible coffee. I remember parking Thunder by the water, her headlights casting a soft glow over the lake as we stretched out on the hood, talking about everything we wanted to do with our lives. Think she'll last us a road trip to California? Billy asked, grinning. I laughed. She'd better. She's got a lot of road left in her. We sat there, dreaming big, as if the world was small enough to hold in our hands. But as the night wore on and the fireflies blinked around us, I couldn't help but feel a tug of something I didn't understand back then. A quiet kind of sadness, knowing that things wouldn't always stay like this. That one day, these nights would be memories. There was one night, I said, smiling at Tommy, when I took your grandma, Sarah, out for our very first date. I was nervous, but Thunder was polished and shining, and I knew there was no better way to make an impression. We drove out of town, the two of us laughing and talking like we'd known each other forever. I'll never forget the way she looked at me under the glow of those dashboard lights. That night, parked under the stars with the radio playing softly, was the first time I realized she might be the one. Thunder was right there with us, every mile and moment, setting the stage for everything that came after. Years passed. I went off to college, your grandma and I got married. Your mom was born, found a job in a different state, and before I knew it, the years had slipped by. And Thunder stayed behind, parked in my parents' garage, slowly gathering dust. Every time I came home, I'd take her for a quick spin around town, just to feel that old spark again. But over time, it got harder to keep her running, and eventually, I had to accept that she'd seen her last mile. One afternoon, I went out to the garage and just sat in the driver's seat, my fingers tracing the cracks in the leather, memories rushing back like old friends. I'd grown up with that car. She'd been there through heartbreaks, triumphs, endless hours of tinkering and laughter. I felt like I was saying goodbye to a part of myself that I couldn't get back. Now here we are, Tommy. Life's funny that way. We think we own things, but in the end, it's really just the memories that stay with us. Tommy looked at the photo, then back at me. Do you miss her, Grandpa? Every day, I whispered, my voice catching in my throat. But I'll tell you something, kiddo. When I look back, I don't just see a car. I see my life. Every road I've taken, every mistake, every laugh, it's all in those memories. We sat there in silence, the rain still pattering against the window. The years had rolled on, but the memory of that old Impala, my Thunder, was still alive. And maybe that was enough. Months passed since that conversation. I'd catch Tommy watching me with a look of anticipation, like he was hiding something, a little secret he was carrying around. I figured he was planning something special for my upcoming birthday. Over the years, he'd surprised me with breakfast in bed, homemade cards, even a day out fishing. But this time, he seemed even more excited than usual. Then came my birthday morning. I woke up to laughter and hushed voices from the kitchen. When I shuffled out of my room, bleary-eyed, Tommy and the whole family were waiting for me by the front door, their faces alight with grins they could barely contain. Come on, Grandpa, Tommy said, tugging at my arm, practically pulling me outside. The sun was shining bright, and I squinted against the glare. But then I saw it, parked right in our driveway, an old blue Chevy Impala, covered in a layer of dust and with familiar, faded lightning bolts along the sides. My heart stopped. It couldn't be. But there she was, Thunder. She was worn, a bit more rusty than I remembered, but unmistakable. It was like seeing an old friend after a lifetime apart. I turned to Tommy, my mouth half open in disbelief. How? Tommy beamed up at me, his eyes shining with pride. Mom and Grandma helped me. We spent months tracking her down, found her a few towns over. She doesn't run perfectly, but she's yours again, Grandpa. I didn't have words for what I was feeling. I could hardly believe it. But there she was, this piece of my past that I'd thought I'd left behind forever. Thunder had come back home. "Go on, Grandpa," Tommy said, holding out a set of keys. "Take her for a spin?" For a second, I hesitated. I wasn't sure if Thunder was up for a drive, but when I saw the excitement in Tommy's eyes, I couldn't refuse. Taking the keys from him, I walked slowly around to the driver's side, each step feeling like a walk through time. I opened the door and slipped into the driver's seat, my hands trembling as they touched the worn steering wheel. The smell of old leather filled the car, bringing with it a flood of memories. I took a deep breath, closed my eyes for a second, and then turned the key. The engine coughed and sputtered, but after a moment, she rumbled to life, just as she used to. It was a bit rough, but she was alive. Thunder was alive. Tommy climbed in beside me, barely able to contain his excitement. "Let's go, Grandpa," he said, almost bouncing in his seat. With a smile, I put the car in drive and eased her out of the driveway. The road stretched ahead of us, and as we rolled down the street, memories flooded over me. The long summer nights with friends, Sarah and I on our first date, the smell of freshly cut grass as we parked by the lake and watched the stars. It was as if, for a few fleeting moments, my whole life was unfolding again, mile by mile. Thunder's engine hummed, a familiar sound that wrapped around my heart like an old friend's embrace. The streets we drove down blended into the memories of all the places she'd taken me, all the roads I'd traveled as a young man. I felt like I'd slipped back through time, like I was 17 again, with the wind rushing through the open windows and the world wide open in front of me. When we pulled back into the driveway, I sat for a moment, letting the engine idle. I could feel the years and memories settle around me, rich and alive, filling the air like the smell of rain on a warm summer night. Tommy looked over at me, his face glowing with excitement and pride. "Did you miss it, Grandpa?" he asked softly. "More than you could ever know," I said, my voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Tommy. Thank you. All of you. This is more than I could have ever dreamed of." Tommy reached over, giving the dashboard a loving pat. "Don't thank us yet, Grandpa. We got a lot of work to do." I chuckled, feeling younger and more alive than I had in years. "Guess we do, kiddo. Guess we do." Thank you for joining me on this journey down memory lane. Thunder wasn't just a car. She was a symbol of freedom, love, and all those unforgettable adventures I once lived. Maybe you too have your own Thunder, a memory, a keepsake, something that stayed with you over the years. What was your first car? What memories does it bring back?